Welcome to Chatter. I'm Benjamin Wittes, Editor-in-Chief of Lawfare. This week, we're talking with Bob Bauer about his new book, The Unraveling Reflections on Politics Without Ethics and Democracy in Crisis.
When I emerged from law school, which was in 1976, the United States was embarking for the first time in its history in a significant degree of regulation of its politics. And that had not been really true for the most part. And I graduated in 76, and I targeted it as a practice that I wanted to develop because it was consistent with my most passionate interest. It's very rewarding work. And, of course, if you win, it's exceptionally rewarding work. When we say the system works, the system is the aggregation of all of these individual decisions under enormous political pressure to do the right things as a matter of law and as a matter of ethics. So that's very difficult, but I count on those people in those positions of responsibility to make a decision that is the right decision to make, even at some considerable personal and political cost to them. And our democracy utterly depends upon that at the end of the day.
So, Bob, we are here a couple weeks after you participated in some deeply important historical events related to a matter that we're not going to discuss. And I just want to put out there for listeners who might be expecting you to talk about the recent presidential debate, that we are going to talk about debate prep, but not this cycle's debate prep. We are going to talk about candidacies. We're not going to talk about this president's candidacy for re-election and the end of it, because we have more important things to talk about. We're going to talk about your book. So for listeners who are expecting Bob to dish about his client, Joe Biden, and the end of the Biden campaign, I just want to say we're not going to be talking about that. But Bob, welcome to Chatter.
Thank you, Ben. I'm glad to be here.
I want to start with the conceit of the book that you have written, which is, I guess, a somewhat regretful look at your career as a political brawling lawyer. And I want to start, I want to fight you a little bit on how defensive it's appropriate to be about being a political brawler. But I want to start with the premise. What is a political lawyer, and what does it mean to have a career as a political lawyer as opposed to any other kind of lawyer?
In the sense that I mean it, and as I lived it in my career, it meant a lawyer who advised on issues that arise out of competitive politics, advise on issues that bear on how people can participate in politics. So it ranges from advice on campaign finance issues, questions of government ethics, disclosure by public officials and candidates of their personal finances, questions that arise under the Internal Revenue Code that affect what advocacy organizations can or cannot do, voting rights, election protection, and also theories of public corruption under which public officials are held accountable for dishonest, corrupt conduct in government. And so it's a whole field package, if you will, around this whole notion that we, to some degree at least, have a regulated politics, and those who engage in it have to seek legal counsel so they can accomplish their goals in policy or politics, win elections or move legislation, but do so effectively within the limits set by law.
And how, the first section of the book is kind of about how you got into this field. Tell us a little bit about that. How does one, I think a lot more people today come through law school and say, I sort of want to do political law than did in the 70s and early 80s. How did you get into this area?
I'll start by saying, by the way, there's another definition of political law, and that can be a lawyer in a particular community, and this is not at all atypical in our American political culture, who, by virtue of being a lawyer, participates in the politics of that community. And they wind up, whether they run for office or don't run for office, they become very important to the way politics is conducted in that community. And that doesn't require them to have any niche regulatory expertise, but they're still political lawyers in that sense. In my own case, I did embark on a career for a long time. I still write and teach it, and I still practice some of it, of a niche regulatory litigation, in some cases, legal practice. And it happened entirely by accident. I'd been involved as a teenager. I was very political in my interests, very intensely political in my interests. I write in the book about the family into which I was born, which was a very political family. And when I emerged from law school, which was in 1976, the United States was embarking for the first time in its history in a significant degree of regulation of its politics, legal regulation of its politics. And that had not been really true for the most part. And even some of the laws that had been passed that were directed toward political activity, like the Federal Corrupt Practices Act of 1925, were passed really primarily as political statements. They were riddled with loopholes and in some cases disregarded altogether. However, in the post-Watergate period, beginning really pre-Watergate in 71, but very accelerated post-Watergate beginning in 74, there were a series of statutes, regulations, institutional changes that took place that reshaped how politics was conducted in a way that required candidates and parties and others who wanted to be involved in politics to be attentive to legal requirements, and it opened up space for lawyers. And I graduated in 76, and really that was roughly around the time all of this began to happen, from 76 on, for several years. And even though I couldn't do it full time, I targeted it as a practice that I wanted to develop because it was consistent with my most passionate interest.
One of the interesting things about the book is the book is kind of an extended meditation on the idea that the fundamental obligation of the political lawyer is to help the candidate win, or help the candidate or the political committee do what it's trying to do, and this sense that we have disregarded the limits in pursuit of victory. So at some level, this is the same anxiety that you read about in a lot of discussions of law and legal practice, right? I mean, you're obliged to help your client, but your client's doing unethical things, right? So how is this dilemma different in the political arena than it is in any other context?
It is not. It's different in this fundamental respect, and that is that if you're engaged in law practice with this strong political element, advising these types of clients, advising on these kinds of activities, yes, you're representing competitors who are seeking office, but you're doing so with palpable effects on how our democratic process operates. Take the extreme case, a lawyer who actually doesn't care one way or the other about how the votes are counted and wants to do whatever they can to rig the outcome of an election in favor of their candidate. Now, that may win them the race or that may lose them the race, but one way or the other, that insensitivity to the broader dimensions of their responsibility, I mean, setting aside, by the way, that what I've described could also be a violation of law. But generally speaking, what we're talking about are activities, advice provided by lawyers that affect the quality of democratic participation and discourse. And I think that it really does raise the bar for how lawyers in that position ought to think about what they do. One of the points that I make in the book, at least I hope I make it in the book, is lawyers in that sense are not different from others who have advisory roles in the process, both within government and in competitive partisan politics. That is to say, if you have responsibilities of that nature, there's a whole public out there beyond your immediate quote-unquote client who have an enormous stake on how well you perform your responsibilities. And they would expect you to pay some attention to their interests. I teach a course at NYU Law which is now my day job, that's entitled The Role of the Lawyer in Public Life. And we don't talk only about campaign lawyers. We talk about lawyers in government who have responsibility in the course of advising presidents, cabinet heads, or others who have responsibility in the executive branch. We talk about the roles that they have and the ethical dimensions of their responsibility to be attentive to those that they serve. And who they serve ultimately are the American public.
All right. So we go back. The book starts early in your career and sort of tracks over time a variety of different representations. And I want to talk about each category separately because I think they're independently interesting. But before I do, I want to talk about a general theme that runs through the book, which is your sense of regret about your sort of street brawling days, which are not entirely behind you, I would add. Just ask Mr. Herr, the special counsel in the Joe Biden classified documents matter. But you have a complicated relationship. Bob Bauer, the analyst and writer who writes learned pieces on lawfare and who also writes very reflective books about his career, has a complicated relationship with Bob Bauer, the party lawyer who will not do anything to help his guy win, but will do a lot of things to help his guy win. And talk me through that complex relationship.
You framed it as regret. I wouldn't say so much that in the book I'm expressing profound regret over some action I can't live with, some piece of advice that was particularly destructive to democratic norms or institutions that I now repent having given. But for me, particularly after this many years in this work, I thought it was the occasion not just of reflection, but of critical self-reflection, that if you're going to have a dialogue about the ethical compass of our politics, then you have to own up to the circumstances in which you weren't really thinking as carefully about some of the collateral costs of seeking victory or avoiding defeat as you might have. And so in order for this conversation to go on, everybody has to be willing to put that on the table, it seems to me.
And just to be clear, which conversation are you talking about here? The how did we get here to this point as a society polarization conversation, the Trumpism conversation, the destruction of norms conversation? Which one are you trying to participate in by putting stuff on the table?
Well, you've named three right there that are interrelated, obviously, in many respects. Polarization, Trump, questions about the vitality, the ongoing viability of long accepted but now questioned democratic norms and institutions. And so, yes, it's in that conversation that I want to situate this critique. And it's not only a critique of my own actions. It's an attempt to assess these problems across the board. I make no bones about my profound distaste for Trumpist politics and the ways in which I think that he is exceptional in his disregard of institutional democratic norms and practices. And yet at the same time, I think that it's important, given how polarized we are, to be able to lay out in front of people so they're listening, frankly, so they don't immediately separate into partisan camps, case histories, some of them from my own career, where reflection on these kinds of issues was less than it could have been. So if people say our politics is rancid, our politics has taken a dark turn, we hate our politics, and by the way, there's a strain of that throughout all of American history. Our American political culture is very skeptical, if you will, of governing institutions in any number of ways. Sometimes it's worse than at other times. But if we're going to have that conversation, then everybody has to be honest, and particularly somebody like myself with a long history in politics has to be honest about where they see shortcomings in their own analysis, their own sensitivity to these issues in the course of their practice.
All right. But if I'm just thinking of the Twitter Dems or the Pod Save America types who are going to listen to this, if they do, and they're going to say, oh, while Bob Bauer is sitting there wringing his hands about his conduct in the 80s in the blank case, nobody on the other side is doing that. They're gearing up to, take a bulldozer to all of our democratic norms. And why is Bob being so finicky about his own behavior and his own participation when there's no analog on the other side for that kind of conversation. And is the goal here, first of all, are you trying to model something here, or is there, or are you just engaging in the reflection that you wish other people would also engage in?
I wouldn't at all make a case for myself as being sort of exceptionally self-reflective. I would say two things in response to your very good question. The first is I still consider myself to be a pretty hard-charging competitor. And I reject, and we can talk further about this, I'll keep this short, I reject the suggestion that we have to basically crash through every democratic norm. We have to reshape our institutions in unattractive ways in order to be electorally successful. I completely reject it. I've seen no evidence that that's true. I just don't agree. I hope I'm not proven wrong, but that is my view. Secondly, there are others with whom I deal with on a daily basis virtually, like, for example, Ben Ginsberg in the Republican Party.
Ben, just for those who don't know him, Ben was the general counsel of the Republican Party for a long time and has been amazingly self-reflective and about and protective of democratic norms.
Correct. Ben was very much a hard-charging competitor, and I met him in that context. I met him in the context of a disputed recount many years ago, and he was on the other side of the table there, and we've been across each other on policy and political disputes for as long as I can remember. However, Ben draws certain lines, and he's public about it. Nobody can match, very few can match his Republican Party credentials, but he will not stand for, and he argues very strongly against, the attacks on the electoral process that we've seen in recent years, the undermining of public faith in the professional work that election administrators do and in the reliability of elections. And he and I travel together around the country. We co-chair an organization called Pillars of the Community. It's completely bipartisan. We co-chair an organization called the Election Official Legal Defense Network, completely bipartisan. And what we try to do is bring Democrats and Republicans together who care about these institutions and norms and practices and have them, whatever their other disagreements, rally around what is necessary to preserve them. And we were recently in Wisconsin. We're soon headed toward Texas. We've been in Georgia. We've been in Pennsylvania. We've been in Arizona. We'll continue to do that. And the rooms in which we conduct these conversations are rooms in which at least half the room are Republicans who probably are not keen on any representation I've ever had, but are prepared to have a conversation like this because they care about the process. So I don't think I'm exceptional in that regard. I just wanted to put forward my particular perspective. And I think at this particular time in our sort of destructively polarized politics, it's a really important conversation to have.
Yeah, I think asking oneself the question in one's own professional environment, what did one do that contributed to polarization or that contributed to the current toxicity is a really worthwhile enterprise. All right, so you started out to go through your Maoist self-critique in this regard. You started out as maybe I should say Maoist self-denunciation. You started as kind of a party lawyer, mostly on the congressional side, and kind of morphed over time into an executive branch or a federal office candidacy, kind of presidential lawyer, as the people that you represented became more and more successful. But in the 80s, and I actually didn't know you until the 90s, I guess, in the 80s you were very much a sort of congressionalist party committee lawyer. So when I look back on your account of that period, I'm struck by how tame everything sounds. What you describe as sort of hard-charging tactics are largely talking to reporters and saying, raising legal questions about what the other side is doing. And a lot of them are defensive, as in your guy gets attacked for blank. Tony Coelho, the Democratic, I guess he was the whip at the
Correct.
time, right?
Whip. Mm-hmm.
When I look back at your account of that period, it actually seems all fine to me. Is there anything, and it doesn't really look like there are a lot of dark clouds on the horizon polarization-wise. Tony Coelho may or may not have gotten a raw deal, but yeah, he was criticized for ethical stuff. He chose to resign. He spoke ill-advisedly to my old colleague Chuck Babcock at the Washington Post. What was the fundamental problem then that you were dealing with as a Democratic Party lawyer?
I wouldn't characterize it as a sort of particular problem. I'm trying to take, first of all, my own story from the beginning all the way through to the present day. So I go from there, as you point out, through campaign lawyering to being a government lawyer when I was White House counsel to Barack Obama, to working on the 2020 election on the sort of election protection front. So part of it is I go back early, not because all of those episodes are, particularly shocking in light of contemporary experience, but because I'm trying to tell a story from sort of beginning to end. But one story I tell, it's completely harmless. And when you say I'm engaged in self-denunciation, I mean, I really don't sweat it.
I am kidding.
Yes, no, I know you're kidding, but it's not that I'm sleepless over these episodes or sort of in some way trying to inflate them to a level of drama they don't deserve. But one of the examples I give is that my party pushed, with, by the way, no hope of success, but it pushed a proposal to change the tax code to discourage a certain kind of advertising, kind of then thought to be in its infancy. It really wasn't, but negative advertising by independent committees. Today they would be called super PACs. It was very distressing to incumbents, and I did represent incumbents, to have these aggressive televised attacks by organizations that weren't all that accountable because they had ideological affiliations, but they weren't formally political party committees. Again, one would think today of super PACs. And we were pushing a proposal to deny what was then an existing tax credit to contributions that were made to underwrite those kinds of attacks. We're bringing the IRS into the middle of the regulation of the political process.
Still seems like a good idea to me.
It may, well, I hope so. I think we don't want the IRS involved in any way in our politics. And it was remarkable to me that this took place only a few years after Richard Nixon was on the brink of impeachment and then gave up his office, in part because he was trying to Internal Revenue Service. And so why in the world would we think that was a good idea? Now, did we have any chance of getting it done? No. But why would we even promote an idea like that? And I don't recall, frankly, honestly, this far along, how deeply this was discussed. But it's an example of an idea that has to be evaluated, not just in terms of its short-term political impacts. Yeah, sure, you want to starve those organizations of funds if you can or make it harder for them to raise them. But it's just a bad, small d democratic step to take. You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't argue for putting the IRS in that position. And by the way, later, I felt the same way about any attempt that was made to use the IRS to monitor and then punish religious institutions for political sermons that were delivered from the pulpit to congregations, whether they were left or right. Let's get the IRS out of that business. So that's just an example of an early experience that I had that at the time, honestly, I thought it was clever. We got some press. I testified before a committee in the Congress as a young lawyer. That was thrilling to me. And the whole enterprise was really ill-considered and somewhat stupid.
And when did you decide that? I mean, by the time you sat down to write the book, you had strong feelings in the other direction. Did that come about as you were contemplating writing the book? You looked back on it and said, my God, what was I thinking? Or did it more creep up on you over the years that you didn't agree with your young self and you were faintly embarrassed by having made that argument and you just wrote it down when you sat to write the book?
Well, at this point, I'm kind of almost more amused and embarrassed that I made the argument. The transcript of the proceeding before the committee that I testified in front is quite entertaining because at one point the chairman of the committee says, "It's really bold of you to come before us with this argument. Nobody agrees with you." But I thought that's distinctive. Then I'm making an argument nobody else was prepared to make. It's more that I thought about it over time. As I was reflecting on these issues, that was one of the examples I thought of that was very appealing to me as a young brawler. And that, again, I don't think was in any way a requirement of successfully competing. It just was saying something, doing something that ultimately was unhelpful to our protecting fundamental institutional norms and practices. And I brought it up in the book because I trace it out through my entire career.
So one of the I think this was the context in which we originally met in the 1990s. I was trying to remember whether it was this or whether it was the Ken Starr investigation, but I think it was campaign finance, actually. And you were quite distinctive in the late 90s for being the only Democratic lawyer who was quite publicly unenthusiastic about what was colloquially called campaign finance reform, which meant more restrictions on candidate and party funding or fundraising and expenditures. And I read this part of the book with particular interest because it was definitely the first period of time in which I knew you, and you were kind of this renegade, like making an argument that has since become, I think, much more accepted, which is that if you restrict parties' ability to raise money and parties' ability to spend money, and what you effectively do is you empower non-party actors and small dollar contributions, which are notionally more democratic, but in fact are, the crazy people. And you're going to create all kinds of terrible incentives. And so my memory of the Bob Bauer arguments of the late 90s and early aughts is that they've aged very well. And that you didn't anticipate the internet fundraising aspect of it, but you did anticipate a lot of the consequences of things like the McCain-Feingold law, the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, and other attempts to regulate money in politics in a fashion that people like me reflexively supported. How do you feel about the last 20 years of campaign finance? Is it basically the grand project in vindicating Bob Bauer 1990s grumpiness, or is it a more complicated proposition than that?
So I don't view it as a vindication of a Bob Bauer project. I started out my career really not having any second thoughts about the post-Watergate regulatory framework for campaign finance restrictions. It was really experience and a little deeper thought that led me to conclude that this was a doomed enterprise at its most extreme expressions, at its most aggressive expressions. I don't have any fundamental objection to limits on contributions and certainly none to disclosure requirements. I'm very comfortable with those. But as you know, we ran into this problem that as each party, as it suited them, or candidates as a whole, began to sort of attack those restrictions, engaging in loophole identification and loophole exploitation, the response of the regulatory community was to try to heap on more restrictions to stop the loophole exploitation. And soon we had this regulatory edifice, which, by the way, has largely crumbled to the ground, that it struck me was not only doomed to be futile, but it was unhelpful, and it had effects like the one you suggested of undermining the role of political parties and elevating the role of third-party interest groups, separating themselves out from the parties. I thought,
and campaigns that run against the party rather than through the party.
Yes. So in all of those respects, I mean, there were just these unintended systemic consequences. And there's another problem as well, which is there are very powerful, recognizing all of the concerns about money in politics, there are some very powerful core First Amendment and associational values that wind up getting, to some extent, kind of crunched underfoot as the two parties compete in a regulatory system. Each party complains about the conduct of the other party, filing complaints, seeking criminal investigations, not because they're really horrified by the conduct that they're attacking. It's because they're worried about the competitive effects, or they want to call attention for political reasons to the activities of the other party and paint them in an unfavorable light. And so I just came to the conclusion that we needed a modest regulatory framework, but that for the most part, we should give as much play to these First Amendment and associational freedoms as we possibly could. And in that sense, you're right. I was out of step with at least the declared approach to these issues of the Democratic Party and the Congress. It's amazing to me that actually I got a way of expressing my views so frankly, because I represented clients who voted exactly the other way. Some of them secretly agreed with me, and others that just decided I was a crank and liked me well enough to keep me on board. But let me make one other point about this. I do this all the time to gull my critics on the other side. The Democratic Party is now able to raise competitive, if not in some instances, superior amounts of money in key races. I think of the Obama campaign against John McCain in 2008. The Obama campaign had so much money at the end it couldn't spend them all, ended up with a handsome surplus. That was not true at the beginning of my career. We were always short of and considered ourselves to be at a permanent financial disadvantage vis-a-vis the Republicans. And believe you me, and I don't think I'm being unfair to anybody and I'm not being cynical, our competitive disadvantage had a large amount of effect, even at a subconscious level, on our embrace of financial regulation. Because we didn't think we could be competitive, and so financial regulation, competitive regulation, struck us as being to our advantage.
And just to be clear, by this you mean you can't compete under the existing rules, and so you want tighter rules by way of restraining the other side.
Correct. And I came up with a theory to try to stop the Republicans from a very clever maneuver to spend more in Senate races many years ago, and I lost deservedly before the Supreme Court 9-0, because the argument I was making to shut the Republican Party activity down was, while successful, I might add, at the Court of Appeals level, an absolute failure at the Supreme Court level, and for good reason, because it was Democrats basically trying to defend themselves against spending that they couldn't match. And that's fundamentally what it was. Now, all of a sudden, I'll say to Democratic audiences where there's this ongoing sort of attachment to campaign finance regulation, give me a number. I do this sometimes in class. I sometimes do it with audiences that I speak in front of. Give me the number that you, committed Democrats, are prepared to cite as a limit you could live with on the amount of money available to you to end Donald Trump's political career. And I've never had a taker. I said, any number. Make it $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion. What's the number you would be willing to live within to achieve what you think is an existential political objective? And the answer is they're not prepared to live with any number, because that objective to them is so critical, an objective I obviously share. So that is a story I do tell in a separate chapter in the book. And I talk about it also in other detailed ways that probably is not of major interest here.
I want to poke at this a little bit, because I think that when I was a young reporter and then an editorial writer, and particularly when I was an editorial writer, I was working at the Washington Post, which had this historic position about campaign finance regulation, which dated at least to the Watergate era and maybe further back than that, for all I know. And so it was never, something that, I ever was kind of allowed to revisit from the ground up. But in the years since I left, one of the things that happened was the Obama campaign, which happened, I guess, right after I left the Washington Post in 2008. And the other thing that happened, which was contemporaneous and we thought of as connected to the Obama campaign, but was in fact an independent effect, was internet fundraising. And the result was that you could raise, $1 billion, and these small money donations that you could kind of crowdsource enormous contributions. And of course, the principal beneficiaries of this over time turn out to be Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, both of whom are effectively running against their own parties, at least in the first instance. And so I'm left with, first of all, I agree with you that the regulatory framework is nonsensical. But secondly, not knowing how to think about what the optimal competitive environment is. Because on the one hand, there isn't a money in politics problem right now. I mean, Chevron and Facebook and whatever can give large sums of money to super PACs and whatever. But it's not like somebody who catches fire politically, either a billionaire, if Donald Trump is a billionaire, or a socialist, has trouble raising enough money to run a highly competitive campaign. And it's not clear what the big money interests, at least at the presidential campaign level, are getting for their money, because they don't seem to be picking the winners. And on the other hand, I look at this and say, but the functional effect of this is very weak political parties, at least on the Republican side, that the Democratic Party still has some heft as a party, but the Republican Party does not. And it has been essentially beaten by these candidates that run against it, both at the presidential level and at congressional levels. And so my question is, has the vindication of the Bob Bauer theory of campaign finance come at the expense of itself driven a kind of polarization? And is there a model of campaign finance that's both plausible and doesn't run in the face of every incentive that, whether your model is water flowing to the sea or whatever, that doesn't fly in the face of the way money will work in this political system, but also doesn't empower or disempower the political parties at the expense of insurgents?
Well, let me begin by saying I think we do have a money in politics problem, or money in politics and government problem. I don't think that's as effectively addressed by the 1970s experiment in campaign finance regulation, which, by the way, in many critical respects has come to an end anyway. It's crashed and burned. There are legitimate reasons to worry about political inequality in the United States. And, of course, the rise of internet fundraising and the rise of the small donor, while definitely a contributor to polarization, because those are the most motivated donors, is nonetheless a small d democratic development. It means people can participate in elections and provide significant financial support for them in a way that wasn't possible before. On the other hand, I think people could look at the amount of money that's spent on lobbying the government once elections is concluded and say there's a role of money in politics that has significant effects on political equality, vast sums of money that are spent by particular commercials or other interests to either advance legislative agendas or to prevent other legislative or regulatory agendas from being implemented. And we have very weak controls on that. Some of those controls are weak because there are constitutional constraints on how far you can go to stop people, to borrow a phrase from the Constitution, from petitioning their government for redress of grievances. But that's a money in politics problem. I think that what we've seen with billionaires like Elon Musk seizing control of a social media platform like formerly Twitter, now X, raises some very serious questions about the role of, if you will, multi-billionaires in trying to control dialogue in some way on political matters in the United States. So I'm not naive that we have significant questions that we have to address about political equality in a society that is characterized by vast wealth inequality. I take it seriously. I'm targeting an old project of, if you will, the liberal Democratic Party of which I've been a part, which is regulating campaign finance. And I think that candidate selection, funding of candidate selection, and I do think that contribution limits are in order, if they're sensibly set and appropriately enforced, and disclosure requirements are in order. But once the system becomes extraordinarily complicated, because the regulators are chasing after every possible loophole or circumvention, it all becomes unwieldy. People involved in politics have to hire lawyers, and I give some examples in my book of how absurd that can be, where normal people want to do simple things and suddenly realize they have major regulatory problems. Then we have to take a step back and say, is this really worth it? What are we getting in return for the cost to normal, protected, appropriate political activity? But I do want to emphasize there are other areas where I think the concern with wealth inequality and political inequality are legitimate, highly legit, if not, in fact, pressing.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I was thinking when I said money in politics and of the much narrower category of campaign finance regulation. But your point is well taken. All right, so I want to migrate from the 80s and 90s representation of party committees to the sort of getting into national campaigns and the derivative consequence of that, which is getting into, the highest levels of national government. How did you come to be Barack Obama's lawyer?
I'm pleased to say, I tell students all the time, it is not because he put together a list of the 10 best lawyers in the United States and I was in the top 3. I knew him and had begun to represent him when he became a United States Senator. And so in the course of that representation, he developed confidence in me, as did his staff. And as a result, I wound up representing his presidential campaign in 2008. As a result of that, once he was elected, I was clearly in conversation from the beginning, although I didn't do it from the beginning, about joining the administration. So it really was the result of just, being immersed in politics at the federal level and representing people who ran for president. He wasn't the first I did represent who was seeking the office of the presidency.
Right. So your first presidential campaign was the Bill Bradley campaign,
Actually,
right?
It was in 1988 for Dick Gephardt.
Ah, right. So you'd represented Gephardt in a number of different capacities.
That's right. I had represented Dick Gephardt across a range of legal requirements that he had, including as an office holder. Yes.
So I want to talk about the White House Counsel period, but let's talk about the antecedent thing, which was being general counsel to a rather large organization and pot of money, which was the Obama campaign. What is the fundamental job of a general counsel of a national campaign that is essentially a giant funnel of money in and then blow a fan of money out? It's raising and spending just an enormous amount of money in a very short period of time. What's the fundamental job?
It's really I'd say on the large side of medium-sized business enterprise that comes into being very quickly, has a short history. It's the term that suddenly came to mind was solar living. It's like this explosion. And then whether through victory or defeat, it sort of comes to a conclusion, gets revived in a re-election campaign, of course. And to general counsel campaign, particularly at the enormous levels of complexity of campaigns nowadays, we're talking about representing a large enterprise with thousands of employees, if you include the ones who were hired at the behest of the candidate by state parties, large numbers of employees. You have labor law issues. You have IP issues. You have every conceivable issue that an enterprise that size might have.
Sounds like a nightmare.
Well, it's very, very interesting work, and you build a significant in-house capacity. So I had a number of lawyers in each of those campaigns who were hired to do different pieces of it, the business piece, the campaign finance regulatory piece. And then there's the broad strategic work that is of absolute central importance nowadays, which is protecting voting rights and election protection, which is something that, by the way, early in 1988 isn't something that campaigns really were heavily lawyered about. I mean, yes, you had election observers and the like, but ever since Florida 2000 and the contested presidential race all the way through the Trump period, that's become an enormously significant part of the legal operation of a campaign, which is to protect its voters' rights and to have the process defended against attack. It's very rewarding work. And of course, if you win, it's exceptionally rewarding work.
And is it fun? I mean, it's at some level, it's obviously a sort of competitive adrenaline rush,
yes,
but it's also, running the labor law stuff for a medium-sized organization in a very compressed time period. You can see how every punchy late night work session becomes a harassment claim. You can see how just a million things become very difficult, and of course, all of them are potential scandals for the campaign and the candidate. How do you make it work?
Yes. Well, let me start by saying, when you say medium-sized, I'm thinking, well, campaigns right now, they raise between $1 billion and $2 billion, and I'm setting aside how much money flows in through allies, from super PACs and like. So maybe it's bigger than medium-sized, to be sure. How do you make it work? It's interesting. It ties into our broader theme. You have to have, first of all, the right direction from the top. The candidate has to take what the lawyers do on a campaign, for that matter, what everybody does on the campaign, seriously from an ethical and a legal perspective. And I've been very fortunate. I've never had to fight candidates about the legal and ethical tone of their campaigns. I understood what they expected, and it was very inspiring for all of us to do what was expected. And then the other piece of it is something all lawyers understand, and that is that knowing the law, understanding how to research it, making strong arguments, writing effectively, when you're litigating, understanding sort of what you need to put together a successful case, all that's very important. Capital J judgment. You're moving very, very fast. You have to separate what's important from what's unimportant, what's strategically central from what's not. And that exercise of judgment at every conceivable level where it matters in an organization is what really determines the difference between this work being successful and it being less successful. And that's just a question of experience over time and hiring the right people. But it's also what makes the work so interesting. I mean, the easy questions, can I do X? Oh, no, here's a rule that says you can't, right? You can't do X. It's when you are in that area that is characterized by both legal uncertainty, political sensitivity, right? Maybe fraught somewhat ethically, that the exercise of judgment becomes of paramount importance.
All right, so let's take a case study. Should the staff of the presidential campaign have water coolers and air conditioning?
Yeah, well, that was a lighthearted example that I put in the book when the Obama campaign opened and we were in the Chicago office. Of course, we didn't know how well we would raise money or where this candidacy was headed, and so there were budgeting decisions to be made. And there we were, I don't know how many stores up in a skyscraper, and it's a Chicago summer, and the question was, are we going to have air conditioning after 6, and is bottled water going to be made available on a continuing basis to all who want it, or are people going to do the best they can after 6 p.m. without air conditioning and then also take the elevator down how many floors, 27, 28, 30 floors, and buy the water downstairs at whatever shop was available? And lawyers, it's not really a legal question. It's a question of what kind of tone do you want to set? How is HR going to run? It's a little bit like other questions of that nature, which goes to the kind of ethos of a campaign.
Right, but it came to the general counsel of the campaign, it was not the campaign manager that made the decision.
Right. The campaign manager did make the decision.
But the campaign manager sought the general counsel's input.
Involved in the conversations, and I took the pro-air conditioning, pro-water available to everybody position.
For non-legal reasons.
Right, but here's the key. You have to be clear about if you're being asked a question like that, when you're giving a legal answer and when you're giving not so much a legal answer but a prudential answer. And one thing clients never appreciate is when a lawyer packages up as a legal conclusion what is a public relation, political, or other conclusion, because then it can never tell. Am I getting legal advice or I'm getting something else? But in that case, when I was asked my view, and I didn't think I was breaching any privileges because it was well known that this was a discussion within the campaign and it was resolved, the air conditioning went on and the water was provided. And I think also everybody understood that we really didn't want staff going around the city of Chicago saying, I worked in 102-degree heat in my office without any water available to me. That was not thought to reflect well on the organization.
All right. So before you become White House counsel, and I'm amazed that we are 50 minutes into this conversation, and this is the first time the words Perkins Coie are crossing either of our lips. You go back to your law firm. And this is the period before this firm, for reasons quite independent of you, this firm's election practice becomes very controversial. And I want to detour a moment here because this is, I think, the last period that you were affiliated with Perkins. But this was the firm that you really, I mean, built your elections law practice in. You were the staple of that, and spent many years there. What's happened to that practice in the years since is a kind of interesting cautionary tale in the demise of certain norms. Not that the firm participated in that, but one of the partners was prosecuted in connection with the John Durham investigation. Another was clearly a subject of Durham's investigation, Mark Elias, and broke off and became a very successful litigator elsewhere. I'm interested for your sense of the Perkins Coie story and how it relates to the thesis of this book.
I don't have anything critical to say about Perkins at all in the book. In fact, I'm very grateful. I found a home at Perkins for a practice that was a fledgling political practice when I first got there in 1980. And I had to build it with the support of the firm from a fledgling practice into a larger self-sustaining practice. And the firm supported me in doing that. And I stayed there with some breaks for government and congressional work, some leaves I took. I stayed there for close to 40 years and built the political law group with the firm's blessing and ongoing resources. I will say also, you mentioned Durham. I can only say that wasn't a Perkins problem. That is a major Durham problem. I could have devoted an entire podcast to telling you what my view is of the Durham investigation, and none of the lawyers caught up in that, including the partner that you referred to, who was, by the way, literally acquitted in a matter of hours.
I was in the room.
Right. Had anything whatsoever to answer for, and the case should never have been brought. And you're quite right. There was the practice did split up. There's still a political law practice at Perkins Coie, and it's a very good one. And then Mark Elias established his very successful Elias Law Group, which does a lot of different kinds of political law, but obviously has become particularly distinguished for recount, redistricting, and voting rights work, litigation. But I think Perkins remarkably, and I'll tell you, I'll give you one example, was remarkably patient with a practice that was pretty politically aggressive in a large commercial corporate firm where any number of my partners had no interest in whatsoever in seeing us in the newspaper and political stories. And one of my favorite stories about that was, I look back on it, I discuss this at length. As counsel to the DCCC, I brought a racketeering lawsuit against the Republican Party, or at least Republican-affiliated organizations, and the then Republican whip, the hard-charging Tom DeLay, who was called the Hammer. And we were challenging what we believed to be very dubious fundraising practices as the Democrats and the Republicans vied for control of the House. And lo and behold, there was a lot of press devoted to this lawsuit. I discussed the merits of this lawsuit in the book quite candidly. I think it ended for us in many respects successfully, but there are questions about whether that was wise to bring a racketeering lawsuit against the House Majority Whip. In any event, one of my partners picked up USA Today and saw a picture of me in the paper and a story about the racketeering lawsuit that had been filed against the House Majority Whip. And I got a phone call from the managing partner saying, "You're getting a lot of attention for this, and some of our Republican partners are asking, what's this all about? Are we okay on this?" And I said, "I think we're fine. I think we had a basis for it, and I think we'll end up resolving it successfully." And he said, "Oh, okay, fine," and hung up. I don't know that that's the way the law firm or any large law firm would respond today, so I'm eternally grateful for Perkins's patience.
All right, so after a year and a half, 2 years back at Perkins, you go to the White House as White House counsel, and I think this is fair to describe as a turning point in your career, in that if I can divide your career into two sections, one in which you're essentially a party lawyer who occasionally does other things, and one in which you are a lawyer with a highly, highly specialized practice representing individuals who may or may not be presidents. This is the point at which you become the White House counsel and then later Biden's lawyer. Is that a fair dividing line?
Yes, it was a congressionally focused practice at the beginning, and then it broadened out and included Democratic Party organizations as a foundation for many years. But it also involved representing non-party political committees, wealthy individuals who wanted to be active in politics, issue advocacy organizations, anybody, again, whose activities raised legal issues. And bicyclists, yes, exactly. Speedo bicycle clubs trying to leaflet for candidates and understanding how the law affected them. And that was a long stretch of the career. Then, as you point out, I did spend a lot of time on presidential campaign activity within that practice, and then came the government. And I left to go into the government, came back to the firm for the re-election campaign for President Obama, and I served as GC to his re-election committee at the time. And it was at that point, in returning in 2011 to the firm to do the re-election campaign, that I began thinking that once that campaign concluded, and it did end up taking longer than I thought it would, I would probably leave the firm, probably continue to represent a handful of so-called legacy clients, people I was particularly close to, one of whom was Vice President Biden, but really put more of my effort into teaching and writing, and that's when my affiliation with NYU Law intensified.
And you describe in the book, it's a most unusual chapter. You describe in the book the White House counsel's office as the best job you have ever had or would ever have, and then you proceed to spend the rest of the chapter arguing for breaking it up and making sure that nobody else ever gets to have this job again. Why should we break up the White House counsel's office and send most of it to the Justice Department?
In fairness, I argue that there still ought to be a White House counsel, and there ought to be deputies to the White House counsel in the West Wing providing legal advice to the president on a day-to-day basis, which I think on site the president has to have. But it's gotten too large. It has become a small law firm within the West Wing, although the lawyers are divided between the West Wing and the old executive office building. And it's a controversial office to begin with. I think it is better if the better part of the core legal work that has to be done, just the basic everyday legal work to support the executive office of the presidency, is done by lawyers who are integrated into the lawyers at the Department of Justice. You'd still have a White House counsel. White House counsel still be in the West Wing, still have deputies on hand so that there's immediate responsiveness to the president and some general centralized direction. But for the reasons I give in the book, I think that the White House counsel's office has had a complicated history, and that it needs to be pared back for reasons relating to, I think, the right institutional balance between what the West Wing needs and a Department of Justice that is fundamentally responsible for providing legal advice, which, by the way, was the case for for the better part of American history until a White House counsel who wasn't really primarily involved with legal affairs was appointed under Franklin Roosevelt. And it didn't really become a small law firm until, of all things, John Dean became the White House counsel under Richard Nixon.
All right. So I want to focus this last part of the conversation on investigations of the president and investigations that you have been involved with, but also non-investigative litigation involving the president, specifically Biden. The book reflects, and your other writing in particular reflects, a kind of despair with the idea, with all the mechanisms we have ever dreamed up for investigations of the president. And I want to ask you about that despair. Why should we look at the past 40 years of the way 50 years now, of the way we investigate presidents and throw up our hands? And what has been the sort of experience set that has convinced you of the futility of the exercise?
Well, I think it's a problem we still have to address, because there is, of course, a core conception we have to preserve of presidential accountability under law. And by the way, when I speak of, and when you discuss investigations of presidents, I'm assuming we should also consider any other high-level officials in the government, in the executive branch. And that's also been the case in the past. So cabinet secretaries, for example, who under these unusual mechanisms like the independent counsel statute or the appointment of special prosecutors have been investigated to avoid the apparent conflict of interest of the president's handpicked attorney general as the investigating party in full control. The independent counsel statute, about which you have written, I still assign your book to my students on Ken Starr. The independent counsel statute was vigorously defended by Democrats, to some extent also by Republicans, upheld in its unusual construction by a 7-1, because I believe Kennedy did not participate in the consideration of the case. A Supreme Court of the United States upheld the independent counsel statute, by which
an opinion by Chief Justice Rehnquist.
By Chief Justice Rehnquist, with a famous dissent by Justice Scalia. And it was an unusual statute because, among other things, the independent counsel was appointed by a special division of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. So the supervisory body was the courts, even though the trigger for requesting the court to make an appointment was a trigger in control of the Attorney General of the United States. And by the time we'd had many years of experience with that, it took a while. Both parties wanted to end it. These investigations took too long. The independent counsels saw it as their mission to indict somebody, because after all, why would they be in business for so long and be spending so much money? The calls for independent counsels to investigate became so politically tempting for each party that they became somewhat indiscriminate. It became weaponized, if you will. And so the independent counsel statute was replaced by the regulations we currently have that provide for the Attorney General to appoint a special prosecutor and set up some balance of authority between the Attorney General on the one hand and the special prosecutor given some measure of independence on the other hand. I think I've written for Lawfare very recently on this. I think there are legal developments that suggest that the role of the independent counsel, the special prosecutor, whether it's by some future president's decision or by some combination of that and developments in the courts, that position may be doomed. That we may really not be able to operate under that kind of scheme whereby we create some quote-unquote independent mechanism for conducting investigations of the president and other senior executive branch officials. But take a look at the experience that we've had with special counsels. Also extraordinarily controversial, extraordinarily divisive. Democrats and Republicans in total disagreement depending on whose ox is being gored. Right? And in Mueller's case, poor Robert Mueller's case, lionized at the outset by Democrats,
demonized at the end.
You're right, and denounced by Republicans, and then each switched sides, with the Republicans cheering on the final report as a vindication, which obviously it wasn't, but nonetheless, and the Democrats expressing total despair that he had not found the basis for some liability for Donald Trump for what was then termed collusion or for obstruction of justice. Experience has to tell us something that isn't working, and the cost to the system of this dysfunction is very, very high. And so what is the answer? Well, I'll just close with this. My colleague and good friend Jack Goldsmith, who co-authored with me a book about reform of the presidency called After Trump, devoted an entire chapter to the special counsel. We thought there were fixes that were possible. We actually proposed the fixes and put in the appendix to the book sample regulations with the reforms reflected in them. Jack recently wrote an op-ed saying it's not going to work. I think we should get rid of special prosecutors. I wrote a defense in Lawfare saying there's still reforms to preserve it. And I think he's right, and I think I'm wrong.
Excellent. Perhaps I want to ask one more thing in this area, which was that you were President Biden's principal counsel in the Hur investigation of the classified documents handling. Was that your first time representing a client in front of either a special counsel or an independent counsel?
Not the first time representing a client, the first time representing the
subject.
The key party under inquiry. Yeah, the subject, yes.
And so I know you've been very vocal in criticism of Mr. Hur, and I don't want to relitigate that question here. But I do want to throw out a provocation at you, which is that, and I know it's going to piss you off, and that's part of the point.
I wouldn't deal with you if I didn't expect some provocation and being pissed off.
So I want to suggest that this is an example that, for all your frustration with it, is actually an example of the system working pretty well for the president. So there is a referral to Mr. Hur, who takes, let's just say, too long to get the thing done, but it does get it done in,
15 months.
15 months. So it takes a long time, but not a crazy long time. Issues a report that is, in your judgment, and I may agree with you, unfair on certain points. And it causes a 3 or 4 day long firestorm, and then it kind of disappears. And nobody today is asking the question of whether Joe Biden committed crimes in his handling of classified information. And to the extent that we are still litigating the question of whether Donald Trump committed crimes in the handling of classified information, but there is now an answer to the what about question, which is that was investigated too, and it was deemed by a Republican prosecutor who Biden's lawyers thought was very unfair to him, unworthy of criminal charges, and by the way, on many different grounds, and not a particularly close case. So when I step back from your complaints about the investigation, I kind of look at it and say, okay, assuming that everything Bob says about the Hur investigation is right, it still seems to me it worked pretty well for Joe Biden, even with the stray comments or drive-by comments about his age and memory. And my question is, are you missing the forest for the trees?
I don't think so. And I'm going to be – I think the better part of grace or wisdom is for me to avoid at this point, after this has been concluded, being sort of pointed in my criticisms of the way the special counsel conducted the investigation. I will draw a fundamental distinction between how the system should work and the happy outcome that the system in this particular instance produced the right result. It may not have worked well. It still produced the right result. And the result was one that I thought was foreordained from the beginning, that there really was not any basis for any suggestion that President Biden had violated any of the relevant statutes that the special counsel was asked to examine. So I think I look at the process and say that didn't work well. I look at the outcome and I say, well, that is the foreordained outcome. I'm certainly glad we got there, but I don't want to suggest that's because it's a specific virtue of the process. One of the things I'll just note, and Robert Hur's not the only one to have done it. Durham did it. Mueller did it. So I can be an equal opportunity critic here. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of report when the whole experience with the independent counsel was with these large tomes that were produced that went beyond giving precise grounds for either finding liability or not finding liability, that involved frequently commentary that was inappropriately about uncharged parties. That was supposed to go out with the independent counsel statute, and under the current special counsel regulations, the reports are supposed to be limited and confidential. And they're not limited. And they're certainly not confidential because every single attorney general commits in advance to making them public. So we're right back where we were with the independent counsel statute as a result of the political incentives and disincentives that Jack Goldsmith has well analyzed in concluding that this experiment has failed. So I want to draw a distinction between a system that worked, I don't think it works well at all, and a good result that I think was the only result anybody fair-mindedly could reach.
Well, I will just point out on the final report that I recommended the abolition of the final report back at the end of the Starr investigation. And to my personal dismay and wounded injury, you and Jack in your book adopted what you called the accountability model and insisted on a final report. And I just want to say you reap what you sow.
Well, fair. But I also want to say two things. Number one, that the idea there was to make it clear that the special counsel should be responsible for fact-finding, and that fact-finding function should be preserved, but that the legal responsibility had to be clearly recognized to be the attorney general's. And secondly, okay, fine, you're probably right and I was probably wrong.
Before we close, I want to ask you about the 2020 litigation, because this was, in my experience with your career, which is actually quite extensive at this point, this was a moment of real fascination. And I think I tweeted, this was before my Twitter account was destroyed by Elon Musk. I tweeted that I felt a lot of lawfare pride in this moment, where it was shortly after the election, and when during this period of Trump's contesting the election, and you came out and gave a press conference on behalf of the campaign and the candidate, in which you basically announced in a very authoritative and bossy tone exactly what was going to happen. And I remember, like, this was all of a sudden Bob Bauer, the street fighting lawyer, was back, as I'm sure he was with Mr. Hur. But this was much more public and speaking on behalf of the rightly elected president. And I'm interested for your reflections on that period. I was proud to know Bob Bauer, the street fighter, in that moment, and I don't want to see him entirely self-denounce as a result. I'm sort of joking, but tell me about the experience of the post 2020 election litigation and contest.
Look, it was an extraordinary experience. Of course, you look back and realize that it was resolved successfully, and it was resolved successfully because so many people with decision-making responsibilities at key points in the system did the right thing. Whether they were, and this goes to the theme of the book, whether they were governors who agreed to certify an election under tremendous pressure from their own party not to do it, whether they were members of Congress who agreed once the Electoral College met and voted that Joe Biden was the duly elected president and that Congress should complete the process on January 6th. Whether there were judges, including Republican-appointed judges, including Trump-appointed judges, who heard preposterous challenges to this election and dismissed them. I mean, in that sense, when we say the system works, the system is the composite. It's the aggregation of all of these individual decisions under enormous political pressure to do the right things as a matter of law and as a matter of ethics. And so it is sad that we continue to live with that. And we do continue to live with it in this election denialism movement. But in the work that I do, not just within the Democratic Party, but with people like Ben and other Republicans, and with election officials around the country, both Democratic and Republican, the work that we do to just continue to hold the line, as hard as I think it can be. We have a Republican candidate who still has the nominee of the Republican Party will not agree that he lost the last election and will not agree to accept the results of the next one, except as he chooses. And that apparently the only metric of importance to him is whether he won or lost. That's going to decide whether he accepts the outcome. So that's very difficult. But I count on those people in those positions of responsibility to make a decision that is the right decision to make, even at some considerable personal and political cost to them. And our democracy utterly depends upon that at the end of the day. We can pass as many legal reforms as we want. We can reform the reforms. But if people are not prepared to step up in those circumstances, there's no recourse we will have.
All right, I lied. I said I wasn't going to ask you any debate prep questions, but I'm going to ask you one because it's in the book.
Okay, it's in the book. How
did you go from preparing Joe Biden for a debate with Donald Trump to being in a swimming pool?
So we had breaks, and during one of the breaks, I decided to go outside where the president's dog Major was looking for someone to play ball with. I picked up a tennis ball. I threw it a good distance. Major was thrilled, brought it back to me. I threw it another distance. He was thrilled. I threw it even farther the second time, so we had longer to run. And then I decided to really heave it. And I heaved myself into a tarpaulin-covered swimming pool and soaked myself up to the waist and went sloshing back in after the break. Various staff people were, throwing paper towels at me. I was trying to dry myself off and put paper towels in my shoes so that my shoes weren't making squishy sounds as I was moving around behind the lectern. And I thought the president had not seen it. The now president had not seen it. But as I was leaving for the evening and I was kind of rushing by him, he said, "Get dry." And I said, "Oh, you knew?" And he said, "Yes, Major told me."
Excellent. All right. It is customary to end chatter by reaching into the chatter box and pulling out a random question. I have one here. What advice would you give to your 20-year-old self?
Never underrate the virtues of taking a deep breath and combine that pause with, wherever you happen to be in your career, a decent dose of humility.
Bob Bauer, you're a great American. It's great to talk to you, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at @ThatWasChatter.